A very good morning, and you're welcome to today's Signpost webinar. My name is Mark Gibson, and I'm the Programme Manager of the Teagasc ConnectEd Programme. As we come to the end of another week of lockdown, we hope that you're keeping safe and well, and maybe getting to explore a bit more of your counties across Ireland, given the pandemic. The Signpost webinar series is brought to you in association with the National Rural Network, Food Drink Ireland, and Dairy Sustainability Ireland. So with the focus now moving to sectoral carbon budgets and the role of agriculture in reducing national emissions, today we're going to take a closer look at methane emissions from Irish dairy systems, and in particular, the measurement and mitigation of the gas. And I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Laurence Shalloo, who's a research scientist in Teagasc Moorpark, Katie Starsmore, who's a research technician with the Vista Milk Project, and Dr. Ben Lahart, who is a postdoctoral researcher with Vista Milk, also based in Moorpark. You're all very welcome to this morning's webinar.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks so much, Mark.
And we're also joined by Pat Murphy down in Wexford. Pat is the head of the Environment Knowledge Transfer Programme in Teagasc, and Pat, you're going to be helping us with the questions afterwards. So Laurence, if I could start with you, maybe you could introduce yourself to us and tell us a bit about the work that you're doing in Moorpark.
Yeah, so thanks, Mark. Laurence Shalloo, based here in Moorpark. I suppose a large part of our focus now is on sustainability. As you know, up to now, probably very much was focused on economics and systems, but sustainability now is very much to the core in what we do here, whether it's from a water quality to a greenhouse gas point of view.
Very good, thanks, Laurence. And Ben, if I could ask you to tell us about how you're operating within the Vista Milk Project.
Yeah, so thanks, Mark. So currently we're doing experiments looking at, suppose, animal traits, the influence genetics and the potential feed additives, and how they're going to influence methane emissions, and improve efficiencies within pasture-based systems at present.
Great.
Yeah.
And what's your own background, Ben?
So I'm from Kilkenny. So I did a degree in ag science in UCD, and I graduated in 2016. And I did a PhD, which I finished up last year here in Teagasc Moorpark.
Very good, very good. I like the way you started with the Kilkenny part.
Yeah.
And Katie, you're very welcome, first of all, to the Signpost webinar. Could you tell us a bit about your own background?
Yeah, so as you can probably tell from my accent, I am from New Zealand, and I've been here since 2019. And since I've been here, I've been measuring methane from dairy cows lactating and during the dry period as well. So my background is I grew up on a dairy farm in New Zealand and then went and did the Bachelor of Science, and then after graduating I've ended up here, so that's my story. Brilliant.
And I understand you're starting a PhD as well yourself.
Yeah, I've just started that, a couple months ago.
Well, best of luck with that.
Thank you.
So Laurence, you're going to give us a few slides, some context to the situation, and then Ben and Katie are going to follow. So we'll hand over to you, Laurence. And just while you're getting set up, to remind everybody that if you do have questions for the team, please do use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. And today's webinar is being recorded and will be available also on the Teagasc website, as well as the slides. So we will talk to you after the presentations.
Okay, thanks, Mark. And I suppose, just to acknowledge that Katie and Ben are here, but Jonathan Hearn, who is also part of this research work, is in the background, and we'll hear from him some other day. So I suppose just what I want to do here is just give a little bit of background to the story, talk a little bit about emissions, and then focus a little bit to why we are more interested in methane now than we were maybe a little bit in the past. To start off, what I want to do is just talk about ruminant agriculture and talk about what we're trying to do, what we're trying to achieve. And I suppose it's important that we contextualize, what ruminant agriculture is trying to do. So I suppose if we look at total protein efficiency, in broad terms, it's protein produced that humans can eat versus protein that's consumed by the animal. And that's probably not very useful, because to a large degree, most of what the animal eats, we can't consume as humans. So, when we look at efficiency of our system, a much more useful thing to look at is net efficiency or net protein efficiency. So what that is really is human edible proteins produced by the system versus human edible proteins consumed by the animal. And really what we're trying to do with our system is to, I suppose, to a large degree, maximize the human edible protein that we produce while minimizing the human edible protein that our animals consume. Because, as we go forward, the question will always be asked, does it make sense that animals are eating foods that humans can eat? And that's something that I think over time will become a bigger question. So I suppose this work that the slide I'm going to show you now is based on work that was done in France, and it was adopted by work that was done by Wilkinson and Ertl in 2011 and 2015. And actually, we're following that up with work ourselves in the same space here. So basically, when we look at total protein efficiency, we can see that both TMR and TMR is total mixed ration. It's where animals are housed pretty much all year round, and the milk is produced indoors. And virtually, 85% of the milk in the world is produced in that format. Versus grass-based, where animals are, out grazing, which is similar to our system. So I suppose from a total protein efficiency point of view, they're both quite similar. At 25, 26% in terms of overall efficiency. But when we look at net protein efficiency, so human edible in versus human edible out, where animals are, where most of the milk is produced in the world, animals, that ratio is at 1-to-1. So we get 1 kilo of human edible out for 1 kilo of human edible in. And from a grass-based system, that's roughly about 2.6, 2.7-to-1. So much higher ratio of human edible out versus what's going in. And again, as I said, this is based on French work. When we do the same exercise with using Irish data and modeled Irish scenarios, we come up with a ratio of 4-to-1. So I suppose as we go forward, as we look at our systems going forward, and you look at the overall sustainability of our systems, the higher that ratio is, the better. And I suppose a grass-based system is positive in that sense. I suppose the next step in this analysis, and it's work we're working on in the moment, is looking at the opportunity cost of the land. If that land that is used to produce feed for the animal that we can't eat was used to produce a different product that humans could eat, how would that affect the numbers? And that's called land use ratio, and that's something we're working on. But again, it's quite positive from an Irish context in that calculation. So just then looking at how, sustainability, and look at our grass-based system versus animals that are kept indoors, how do we compare? And this is again, don't worry about the detail here, but just to say that a grass-based system has a lower footprint than a confinement-based system. And this is based on work we did a couple of years ago, where we modeled indoor and outdoor systems. And in that, essentially, our grass-based system had a total footprint that was about 15% lower than the confinement system. Yes, the makeup of that was different. There was different proportions of enteric fermentation. The bought-in feed was a much higher proportion of the confinement system or the TMR system versus the grass-based system. So that's the first point. When we look at the overall sustainability, and we look at the relationship between, for example, greenhouse gases to profit, basically what we can show is that our farmers that are more profitable generally have a lower carbon footprint. So this is based on work we did 3 or 4 years ago, where we looked at the National Farm Survey, we modeled it, and we looked at the relationship between profit and greenhouse gases. So generally, our farmers that are more efficient have a lower carbon footprint and are more profitable. Then I suppose if we look then further and say, how do we compare against other countries in terms of our carbon footprint? And again, this is based on work that we did maybe 3 or 4 years ago, where we compared a top performing, kind of almost a research setting for Ireland versus the UK versus the US. And in that scenario, what we showed was that basically the footprint in Ireland was about 9% lower than the UK and about 12% lower than the US. So top performing farms in Ireland, the UK and the US, you can see that the Irish footprint was lower than the others there that we're comparing against. Again, that was work we published a couple of years ago. This slide has gone up very frequently. Some of the audience would have seen this many times. And what it basically is, a piece of work that was done in 2010. I completely accept that it's dated, but it's a good reference point because it's a piece of analysis that was done using the same approach, same models, and same methodology. So what it was the JRC, or the Joint Research Group, did an analysis of different countries in Europe where they compared the carbon footprint of milk from different countries. And basically what they showed was Ireland was the lowest, or joint lowest, across the EU at that point. Now, the fact that this is 10, 11 years old, that the data is probably 15 years old, obviously means that the value of this going forward is reduced. But it's a good reference point to where we were a number of years ago. Probably the most recent analysis that was done on a country comparison was done a few months ago, and it was done by the Dairy NZ and Ag Research in New Zealand, and basically what it did was it took published studies and it took data from those published studies, and it related those to each country. There's many problems with this study, and we've gone through this in the past, but just to compare, I suppose, just to talk about it for a second and just see where the numbers lie. In this study, you can see here that Ireland came out at 1.18 based on their numbers, and for example, the likes of New Zealand had a carbon footprint of 0.74, and there's other countries in between. I suppose when we looked at the report, we found many errors. We went back to the authors on the errors, and essentially based on the authors accepting these errors, they actually recalculated the report and regenerated the report with a new set of numbers for Ireland, right? So that's the first thing. But I suppose that actually probably doesn't explain maybe some of the bigger issues with the report, in terms of some countries are in there representing individual countries. An example would be Portugal. Portugal is in there at 0.86. And the data for Portugal is based on the Azores, which probably is a long way from Portugal, and is a small group of farms and so on. So just to say that point, that the report, when calculated correctly, had us down at 107. I suppose there's a lot of work going on in this research from a greenhouse gas point of view over the last number of years, and particularly done in Johnstown Castle in relation to nitrous oxide and emissions from urine, from dung, and from fertilizer. And we've put all those, I suppose, into our carbon footprint models. And when we do that, our carbon footprint model comes out with a carbon footprint of less than 1 kilo of CO2 equivalent per kilo of fat and protein corrected milk. So a substantial reduction without any change in activity data, just changing the emission factors. And these are emission factors that are now included in the national inventory. So they're very accepted. They're from published work. We can see that our carbon footprint has gone down under 1 kilo of CO2 per kilo of fat and protein corrected milk. So that brings us down to roughly around just roughly 1. So that's what our carbon footprint looks like. And I just said earlier, the New Zealand one in the report was 0.74. If we include direct land use change, so land that was converted from forestry into pasture from dairying, that brings the New Zealand figure up to 0.88. So really what we're trying to say here is that we're very close to countries like New Zealand in terms of carbon footprint based on published work. Most of the other studies in this report I would to a certain degree discount, because it's not a similar methodology, or it's not a similar calculation process. So I suppose just to say that we're quite similar to New Zealand in terms of our overall footprint. The question is, where do we go from here? And I suppose this is just to paint a picture of where we're going to go. I suppose we're roughly at 1 kilo of CO2 equivalent now. The inclusion of protected urea, and this has been covered many times in this forum, would bring us down to roughly 0.92 in terms of carbon footprint. The inclusion of protected urea, as well as lower crude protein concentrate, and the lower crude protein concentrate has a direct impact on the land use change. So less soya, less land use change, less feed coming in from South America obviously has a strong impact on the carbon footprint, to bring us back down to roughly 0.85. Better performance, higher performance that we expect to get over time would bring us to roughly 0.8, and the inclusion of carbon sequestration in our numbers will bring us to a figure of 0.7. And that 0.7 just happens to be the Signpost target. So the Signpost target for the Signpost program is to generate milk with a carbon footprint of 0.7. And I've just gone through the pathway to get there in terms of protected urea, lower crude protein concentrate, higher animal performance, the inclusion of sequestration. And as I suppose as more technologies come on, that target might even get lower. So a large part of what I just discussed is background. What I want to talk about now is where we go forward in terms of strategies, in terms of what we're trying to achieve with mitigation, in particular in relation to methane. So I suppose just one point on the mitigation strategies, and I think it's important to distinguish. There's two approaches. One is to focus on mitigation strategies that reduce the carbon footprint. So these are largely efficiency measures. So they'll reduce the carbon footprint, but they may or may not be associated with a change in absolute emissions. So the example here is genetics. So genetics is associated with a reduction in carbon footprint. So a kilo of milk drops from, we'll say, 1 to 0.9 based on genetics. But because milk yield per cow goes up, there may not be a change in the absolute emissions. So that's one approach. The second approach is the absolute emissions. So we have some technology that generally reduces total emissions, and it may or may not have an impact on the footprint. If it reduces performance, it will have a deleterious effect on the footprint. If it doesn't, it might. So I suppose to distinguish between the two, the efficiency type measures are generally ones that will increase profitability at farm level as well, whereas the absolute ones may not increase profitability. So, you know, the efficiency ones, farmers are going to be incentivized based on efficiency to adopt. The absolute ones, we may need some other measures to encourage farmers to adopt. And I suppose really what we want to focus on is the ones that reduce both the footprint and the absolute emissions and can increase efficiency. If we focus on those, they essentially will increase profitability and will increase farmers' willingness to adopt. So that's mitigation. Just to talk a little bit, and I'm nearly finished up here, about methane, and in particular biogenic methane, and maybe discuss for a second about, you know, new metrics and how they might affect the overall numbers. So this slide is quite busy, but I just want to get through the broad premise from the slide. And just to, what is biogenic methane? And biogenic methane is essentially emitted from biological processes, including livestock. So what is it? So plants, through photosynthesis, absorb carbon dioxide. So during that process, they're absorbing carbon dioxide. The ruminants eat the plants. They break down the indigestible cellulose in their rumens. And the carbon that's locked up, the CO2 that went into the plant, that's now in the cellulose, is released during that process in the form of methane. And after about 12 years, the methane is converted back to carbon dioxide and the cycle starts again. So that's the process. So CO2 through photosynthesis going into the plant consumed by the animal, and the methane released through that carbon. And after 12 years, it's broken down, and that CO2 is available to go back into the plant again through photosynthesis. Whereas in terms of why is that different to fossil fuels? Well, I suppose we're talking about hundreds of thousands and millions of years from a fossil fuel, that carbon being locked up. The cycle is probably similar or the same, but the time frame is hugely different. So it's stored for a very long time. So I suppose, there's a lot of debate about, new metrics for methane and what impact they might have. So I suppose if we just stand back from it and look at a situation where methane is constant, so no change in methane from the system. So what you have there is the same amount of methane being produced as being oxidized. So essentially methane not changing. There is little additional, and the important thing here is additional warming effect. So if methane isn't changing, the additional warming effect is not changing. So that's important in terms of understanding, I suppose, the differences between the metrics. So just to demonstrate that, what we've done is we've showed the Irish methane production under GWP 100, which is the standard approach that we use in most of our work, versus GWP star. And I suppose GWP star reflects that methane has a half-life of 12 years and has a higher multiplier. So over that shorter period, the warming effect is much higher using the GWP star. But that almost doesn't matter if there's no change in the methane. If methane is going up, the effect is much bigger. If methane is going down, the effect is much bigger. But again, if there's no change, it's almost irrelevant what the numbers are. GWP 100 is what we're used to. That gives a multiplier to methane of about 28 times CO2. So essentially the warming effect or the carbon effect is 28 times the value of CO2, whereas nitrous oxide is 265 times. So just to give a set of numbers, and again, the detail here, not important at all, just to demonstrate, these are our national inventory methane numbers from the last 20 years. And essentially what we have here is, you know, a significant variation across years, you know, 547,000 tons of methane in 1998 versus 518 or 519,000 tons in 2018. So significant variation across years, probably at its lowest point here in 2011, increasing since then with the increase in dairy cow numbers. And that has a direct effect on the CO2 equivalent, which is just a direct multiplier of the methane. When we look at the same exercise, and again, this is the same slide, just looking at 2018 to 2010, same slide. When we look at it using GWP star, and remember the calculation for GWP star refers back to 20 years ago. So it's a very simple calculation. It's, you know, where we are today from a methane point of view multiplied by 100 minus where we were 20 years ago multiplied by 94. So there is a small residual effect in the calculation. What this calculation shows is in the last decade, from a methane perspective, there was a cooling effect. So that's important. From a methane perspective, there was a cooling effect in the last decade. And since 2017, we've just started to go into positive terms. And that really means is that, you know, it's only in 2017, 2018 that the methane numbers has started to increase beyond where they were 20 years previous in the overall calculations. So just look forward then and look, you know, what does that mean for the overall numbers and how does that, you know, multiply up? So what I've just shown here is a situation where we have 2010 to 2030 in terms of, you know, our standard GWP 100, which we normally use to calculate the emissions. And we can see here that with a 1% increase from 2018, we're having a slight increase over time, going from maybe 13.5 million tons up to maybe 14 million tons in terms of our CO2 equivalent over that period of time. With GWP star, with a 1% increase, and this is what I talked about earlier in terms of we're just starting going into the positive territory now, with a 1% increase in emissions in methane per year, what essentially we're showing here is that actually there is very little difference between GWP and GWP star by 2030. So, you know, with a 1% increase in methane, the increases goes quite close up to the GWP 100 from a methane perspective. If we have a static situation from methane, what we're looking at here is we're looking at it, you know, the number being somewhere less than 10 million tons. If we had a 1% decline, we're looking at somewhere around 1 million or 5 million tons. And if we had a 2% decline in methane over that period per year annually, we're looking at somewhere around almost zero or no effect. So essentially what this is showing us here is that with GWP star, the effect of change in methane is grossly magnified. And I suppose there's a lot of debate out there now around, you know, should we have a separate target for methane or not? And I suppose what this shows here is, you know, having a separate target for methane, the multiplier, the effect using GWP star or using the, I suppose, maybe a metric that better reflects the lifetime of methane and its impact. Basically, what this shows here is the magnifying effect can be much bigger, you know, and the power of methane in our inventories or in our calculations becomes much bigger. You know, what does all this mean? And I suppose what we just put in here is where we are in terms of livestock numbers. This is the livestock numbers in December from the CSO over the last between 2005 and 2020. And clearly what this shows is since 2017, we're starting to see a slight decrease in overall livestock numbers from a methane from an overall livestock perspective. So I suppose combine that with the previous slide in terms of where, you know, an increase in methane, the impact that might have, and maybe potentially where we're going or what has started to happen over the last 3 or 4 years from this is CSO, this is actual livestock numbers in December. Basically, we're starting to see a slight tail off in the overall numbers. So two of those together are saying that, you know, the effect on methane obviously will follow. So before I hand over to Katie, I suppose just to summarize, you know, and this probably for me justifies why there's a need and a requirement for much more focus on methane as we go forward. the importance of methane mitigation increases under GWP star metrics. So, you know, the effect of an increase or decrease in methane is much, much more magnified. So I suppose whatever, you know, research, whether it's on where we are today, you know, what the effect of grass quality is, what the effect of genetics is, what the effect of, for example, age at finish is in terms of the methane effect, or even additives, what their effect becomes much, much more important in a scenario where we use a different metric to the one that we're currently using. So Mark, that's it. I'll hand it over there to you, Katie, now, and I'll stop sharing here.
Okay, thank you, Laurence. And just a reminder to everybody that we've had some questions there, whether the slides will be available. Yes, they will. They'll be available on the Teagasc website afterwards. So Katie, we'll hand over to you.
Perfect. Can you see my screen there, Mark?
That looks good.
Perfect. So at the moment we have 4 grain feed machines, and I'll talk more about what they are, but that's what we're using to measure methane at the moment. So currently with the trial work that we're doing, we have over 150, I think there's around 165 cows that are being measured at the moment. So there's 3 main trials that will be going on this year. The first one will be a full lactation trial, which Ben will be carrying out on the Kilworth farm. And he'll be looking at the methane profiles throughout a full lactation, and then also looking at breed impacts as well, and genetic impacts, looking at the national average and elite herds, as well as the Jersey herd. Then I've just carried out a spring grazing management trial, so looking at the effect that silage supplementation in the early spring and the effect that has on methane. And later on in the year, we'll be looking at the effect that white clover within the sward has on methane emissions. So previously, we've done 4 winter trials, so that's been mostly looking at feed additive work, and we've done 1 mid to late lactation grazing study. So how and why are we measuring methane? So I guess the first point that's important to note is that 95% of methane that's emitted is actually through burping or eructation, and also through exhalation. So the way we measure methane, it's really important that we capture that release. So we measure methane through the mouth, and only 5% is through flatulence. So that's why we're measuring through the mouth. So the way we measure methane is through this machine called a green feed. And so this is technology that's come from America. And the way this works is, as you can see in the photo there, a cow puts her head into the machine, and each cow has an electronic identification tag, and so the machine is able to read that tag, and so we know exactly what cow goes in when and how often. So when she puts her head into the machine, the air that she's breathing out while she's in is sucked up. It's sucked up through an air filter, then goes up this chimney bit you can see there, and just before the air is expelled back to the atmosphere, an air sample is taken. So this air sample is then taken back down to the sensors, which is underneath the feed bin. So what we can see on the left-hand side there is what the cows see when they walk into the machine. So as the cows walk in, you can see the silver dish at the bottom there. That's the feed bin where the air is sucked in through. So I don't know if you can see, but there's little holes in the feed bin there where the air is sucked in through. And so I guess the incentive for the cows to visit this machine throughout the day while they're grazing is that they get little bits of concentrate. So we've programmed it so that the machine will drop feed every 20 to 25 seconds over a 2-minute period. And each of these drops is only 30 grams, so she's getting around 300 grams every time she visits the machine. So we're trying to limit the amount of concentrate eaten, but also trying to maximize the time in the machine. So to be able to get accurate results, we need to get at least a 2-minute period in the machine. The photo on the right there shows the machine parked up next to the grazing plot. And so the trailer is moved around the grazing rotation to follow the cows. So the cows have 24/7 access to this, except during milking time. So on average, the cows visit the machine around 2 times a day, and that seems to be giving us good amounts of data to be able to accurately estimate their methane emissions. So now we just look at the visit pattern. So this is what we classify as a visit that's over 2 minutes long, and so each visit is one individual cow visiting the machine. And so what we see here is that the visits vary throughout each hour of the day. And what we found interesting is when we looked at this, that almost the peak is at the early morning of the day. So at 1 o'clock in the morning, you see most cows visiting the machine, which we thought was interesting. It's just a bit of animal behavior, I guess. And then there's a drop off at 2, 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning. And the reason we think why that's done that is because the machine is set up that the cows can only visit once every 4 hours. So if the cow's visiting at 1 o'clock, she won't be able to get any more concentrate until 5. She can still visit the machine, but she might not stay long enough because there'll be no concentrate dropping for her. So that's just a bit of interesting animal behavior stuff that we're seeing. Then when we look at the visit pattern, we also see, so we have each of those bars. So the blue is parity 1, the red is parity 2, and the green there is parity 3. So parity 1 is first lactation, parity 2 is second lactation, and parity 3 is third lactation onwards. So we thought, just from like experience in the field, that the older cows might be more dominant in visiting the machines more often, but what we can see is that it's an even spread between all ages of the cows. So that's looking very promising, that that there's no dominance or bias effect coming into play for that. And you can see that the visits drop through at milking time, which is what we expect when they don't have access to the machine. So just quickly look at the methane that we're getting. So this is the diurnal pattern. So the diurnal pattern is showing that the methane drops during milking time, which could be as a result of the lack of measurements. And then it increases shortly after milking, which could be a result of the cows going into fresh grass, so they'll eat more, which will result in more methane being produced. So when we compare it to the graph on the right, which is an indoor beef system here in Ireland, we see that after feeding time, the methane increases as well. So what is quite clear is that the methane is expected to increase after a feeding intake increases. So the data that from the grazing diurnal pattern there was from the end of lactation last year. So now we'll just look into the research areas, and I'll pass you on to Ben in a second, but I'll just quickly talk to you about the sward factors. So what's important to note is that when you increase grass quality, you would decrease the methane output per kilogram of dry matter eaten. But in saying that, when you have a higher grass quality, cows generally decide to eat more, which results in an increase in absolute methane emitted throughout that day. So, and there also could be factors that we need to look into with white clover and multi-species as well. So we'll be looking into the white clover at the end of this year, but previous research has shown that it can decrease, well, the inclusion of clover could decrease the amount of methane emitted per kilogram of milk produced. So that could help with the efficiency measures, as Laurence was talking about before. So I'll pass you on to Ben now, and he's going to talk about the animal factors and the feed additive work we've been doing.
Okay, thank you, Katie. Okay, over to you, Ben.
Yeah. All right, can you see that there?
Yes, that looks good.
Yeah, perfect. All right, hello everyone. I'm just going to pick up from where Kate left off there and just talk about the other two areas we're looking at presently in relation to methane with the green feeds. So the first of these areas is animal factors / genetics, and the second is the potential of feed additives. So you can see there in the picture on the right-hand side, that was the herd of cows we had using the green feed last year, and we had a nice spread of animals. We had 46 animals using the machine, and we had methane recorded daily. So in addition to methane, we also had records of daily milk production, and we also had weekly live weight. So we're able to look at how these relate to methane output and the efficiency. We also had different lactation numbers, so we were able to look into this as well. So in terms of lactation number within the herd, so what we observed was that parity 3+ cows were producing significantly less methane per kilo of milk solids output. So they were more efficient in producing milk. This is because they're more productive and are diluting the amount of methane they're basically producing. The younger parity cows basically have to put more energy towards maintenance requirements and growth. So that's basically reducing their efficiency. So what this means is as farmers improve their fertility, increase longevity, they're going to increase efficiency of milk production within their herd. Another thing we noted was that lighter animals, so smaller animals within the herd, were producing less methane per kilo of milk solids output. this is because they have lower maintenance requirements and are more efficient because they're able to put more of their intake towards milk output. And finally, and I suppose it's a small bit obvious, but animals are producing more milk solids are producing less methane per kilo of milk solids. This because they're diluting their methane emissions because they're more productive. So what this means in combination is that we select for these traits, we're going to select for improved efficiency. But when we think again about the economic breeding index, which we currently have in Ireland for selecting the next generation of dairy replacements, we're already selecting for these traits. We're selecting for increased milk solids output, we're selecting for better fertility, and we're selecting for lower live weight through the maintenance sub-index. So we're already selecting for increased efficiency within our herds through DBI. We're selecting for lower methane per kilo of milk solids output. So we recently did research that we got published in the Journal of Dairy Science, and it's in press at the minute, looking at the total greenhouse gas emissions profile of animals of divergent economic breeding index. So we used the next generation herd for this, which is basically two groups of animals managed within the same herd and €100 difference in terms of their EBI. So we use the life cycle assessment analysis, which basically measured their total greenhouse gas emissions profile. So this is methane, carbon dioxide, and nitrous oxide emissions, to quantify what was the total environmental effect of selection on the EBI. So there was no absolute difference in greenhouse gas emissions between high and the average EBI cows, but there was a difference in the breakdown of the emissions between the cows. So the high EBI cows had greater emissions from the lactating herd, greater methane emissions from the lactating herd, I should say. This because they're older, they're eating more grass, and they're producing more methane as a result of this. But this was offset by lower emissions associated with rear and less replacements. So this basically balances the total greenhouse gas emissions between the two groups on an area basis. But when we consider that the lead herd are producing 10% more milk output because they're older and they're more productive, this is basically diluting their greenhouse gas emissions, and it's leading to 10% lower greenhouse gas emissions per kilo of milk output. So for each €10 increase in EBI in this study, we observed 1% less greenhouse gas emissions per kilo of fat and protein corrected milk. So €10 is the average rate of genetic gain in EBI per year. So as farmers continue to select on the EBI and improve the EBI annually, we're going to see a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions intensity by 1% per year. So over a 10-year period, we want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions intensity by 10%. This is very positive, and it's going to mean that the EBI is continuing to select and improve the carbon footprint of milk that's been exported from Ireland. But it won't have any effect on total greenhouse gas emissions on an area basis. So to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by selection on DBI, we're going to have select for methane. So DBI has been fairly static over the last few years. There hasn't been much change to it. So to include a new trait in the breeding index, such as methane, you need to meet 3 criteria. So the trait needs to be socially or economically important. I would think methane is socially important. The trait also needs to be variation there for the trait. So you can see there in the graph on the right-hand side, this is data we had from the herd last year. So you can see there this relation between methane and milk solids output. So you can see for any given level of milk solids output, there's nice variation there for methane in that there's high and low methane emitting animals. So there is scope to select these low methane emitting animals. But I suppose the final thing, and this is going to probably be the biggest obstacle, is the routine availability of data. So you need lots and lots of records of animals to generate breeding values. So we don't have these at present for methane. We have the green feeds here in Moore Park. They're measuring methane on 150 cows, but you're going to need much, much more data to generate breeding values. So there's research ongoing in Vista Milk, looking at the potential of milk recording, which will be conducted in the next few years by Sinead and Ireland, and this will be interesting research to follow in this regard. And I suppose finally, once you've decided that you're going to include methane, what you include the trait as, the trait definition. Are you going to select for lower methane in total, lower methane per unit of milk output, or lower methane per unit of feed intake? I suppose potentially lower methane per unit of feed intake would be a suitable fit for grazing system, as we don't want to reduce feed intake in grazing systems. Feed intake is a very important trait for lactating dairy cows to improve their energy status and improve their fertility. So if you get a whole feed intake constant and reduce methane for that given level of feed intake, that could potentially be a good thing to select on. So that's genetics, and then moving on then to feed additives. So feed additives are another thing that can be potentially used to reduce methane emissions. So there have been a large number of studies conducted indoors over the last number of years, with varying degrees of success, and there's been some big headlines. You can see there up to 80% reduction in methane emissions, no effect on milk yield supplementation on seaweed. So these are just some of the different additives. They all work in slightly different ways, but they all have the same end result if they're successful in that they can mitigate methane. So you can see there that the range in efficacy between 10 and 47% on average between those studies. But these studies have been conducted indoors. So within indoor settings, animals, are generally offered total mixed ration diets, and this allows basically farmers to supplement cows with feed additives within the diet, continuously mixed through it. So each time an animal consumes feed over the day, it's getting the additive continuously going into its rumen, which is it's having a very positive effect on the ability of the additive to reduce methane. In grazing systems, we're a bit more limited in that we can only supplement once to twice daily at evening and morning milking. So it kind of limits us in our ability to have a large effect on the success of these additives. So we conducted 2 experiments last year looking at the potential of 2 different additives and their effect on methane emissions and milk production in grazing dairy cows. So we did 2 independent studies. In one study, we looked at a blend of phytochemicals, and the second study, we looked at a blend of seaweeds. So within the phytochemical study, the animals were offered 1 gram of phytochemical per kilo of concentrate, and they were compared to a control group which received a standard kilo of concentrate without the inclusion of the phytochemicals. And within the seaweed study, the animals received 70 grams of seaweed per kilo of concentrate. So the seaweed was a mix of red, green, and brown seaweeds. And these again were compared to a control group receiving a kilo of concentrate. So within each of the 2 independent studies, the concentrate was fed over 2 split feeds at evening and morning milking, and the animals consumed grass for the rest of the day. So the animals within each study were randomly assigned to the treatment control group, and methane emissions and milk production were recorded daily. So the results were as follows. So there was no significant effect detected for the phytochemicals on methane emissions. There was a tendency towards increased milk solids output, but there's no absolute reduction in methane per kilo of milk solids, which isn't shown here. In terms of the seaweed then, there was no significant effect detected for methane emissions, or there wasn't no significant effect detected for milk solids output. I suppose it's in early days yet, this research, so we're going to look into more additives. We're going to test more additives this year and see what we find. But it could potentially be required that the additives could have to be tailored to grazing systems. And we could potentially have to look into slow release formulations, but we'll look into that in the future if necessary. So the conclusions are sward characteristics and methane need more research. The economic breeding index is breeding more efficient animals, but it's not selecting for reduced emissions on an absolute area basis. So direct selection for methane may be required in this regard. And virtually all additive research globally is within indoor systems. So we need to focus on additives suitable for grazing systems. So that's it. And if you have questions, fire away. And if anyone wants to find out any more information, you can contact me directly at the email address provided there.
That's great, Ben. Thank you very much. Katie and Laurence, thank you too for your presentations. So I can invite everybody back, and Ben, maybe you could stop sharing your screen for us as well. So we've lots of questions coming through. So given the time that we're going to more or less skip straight to the questions coming through from our audience. But just a quick one for you, Laurence. You were giving us the overall sort of bigger picture in terms of methane. Now there was some of Teagasc senior management met with the Agriculture Committee this week in the Oireachtas, and they said that the current scientific understanding indicates that reducing Irish agricultural greenhouse gas emissions through technical means is challenging, particularly so for biogenic methane produced by pasture-based ruminants. In that context, what's your view in terms of the reducing absolute emissions? And we've heard some of the questions coming through. Should we not be looking at a per hectare type of metric rather than on a per animal or per litre emissions? Maybe you could get your views on that.
Yeah, and I suppose, Mark, that's probably one of the reasons that I kind of, distinguish between a footprint-based approach versus an absolute approach. So, ultimately we have technologies, and Ben went through one of them and from a genetic point of view, that is having a very strong effect on the footprint, but, it is producing more milk. So that means that the overall numbers aren't changing. So essentially the solutions that, will give us both are the ones that are going to be the real important ones going forward. And what are they? For example, if we think about animals that are finished earlier. So at the moment, the average, I think, age for dairy beef animals is something around 30 months. So if they were finished 2 months earlier, 3 months earlier, whatever the number is, that'll have a very, very strong effect on the footprint of the beef that's produced, but also on the absolute emissions. Those animals are they're not around to produce emissions for those 3 months. If we think about things like, the additives that Katie and Ben both talked about, we haven't found the magic bullet yet, but there is some very exciting results coming out, the Australian work on the seaweeds and that, showing that there could be very strong potential in the future in some of these products. Yeah, they're a bit off. Even the Trinop product, even the Bovaer product that's developed by DSM has shown huge potential. Yeah, it's in indoor systems, and we need something in a grazing system, but there is potential. So I would be quite positive over time that there will some solutions come out on the ground. Again, how they're funded, how farmers pay for them, that's the next question. And that's something that, if we have one that increases efficiency and also reduces emissions, absolute emissions, there we're in a real positive space.
Very good. Thanks, Laurence. Pat, we've lots of questions coming in here. So given the time, I think we'll go straight into the questions.
Yeah, okay. A question here in relation to if I can find it, in relation to the cooling effect. How exactly does methane have a cooling effect? And it's just putting that in context. Methane is an atmospheric and greenhouse gas. It is greenhouse gas effect and therefore warms the atmosphere.
Sorry, and that's a very good question. I just spotted that myself. So basically what we're saying there is that if there's more methane being removed or oxidized from the atmosphere than being produced, that means that there's less methane in the system. And that's what we're talking about, whether, it's having and potentially a negative effect. So yes, 100% agree that methane is a global warming gas, but if there's less of it in the atmosphere, and we because of whatever, feed quality or whatever, well then, that's how that effect is there. But except the point that it is a global warming gas and has a warming effect, but just the magnified reducing the amount of it in the atmosphere obviously is having that effect.
Okay, a question in relation to agreed international methodology of calculating the emissions per litre of milk or per kilogram of protein fat adjusted milk. Where are we with kind of agreement on that?
So there's many different methodologies. We have International Dairy Federation, we have LEAP, we have the FAO, we have ISO. But in effect, most studies have little tweaks and differences that make it very hard to compare across studies. So unless the analysis is done using a similar model with a similar assumptions, like that JRC report that was done in 2010, it's very hard to compare. And, for example, I referenced the New Zealand study. The New Zealand study took published data. It's published in the literature, so it was fine. But it's when you start pulling those studies together and try to compare, then you have serious, differences in terms of how the methods are done. So it's not a fair comparison to compare the different studies. But there is standards. But in reality, if we want to compare countries, if we want to compare systems, we really need to use, a combined approach where everyone agrees specifically on the methods and the study has an objective of comparing.
Okay, and I suppose a related question: when, if ever, do you think the IPCC will adopt GWP star for measuring emissions?
So again, there's a lot of work going on at the moment. There's IPCC are looking at it, the FAO are looking at it. There's a lot of working groups, and we're involved in it. Teagasc are involved, the department are involved in working groups looking at the metric as part of the overall numbers, and looking at what is the right approach. I suppose, there is a lot of, like, pardon the pun, hot air around it as well, because a lot of people get a bit emotional about it. But in reality, all we're looking for is the right approach to calculate emissions in the most accurate fashion. All these in effect are models and methodologies. They will all be wrong, but what we want is the approach that's the most close to what's reality. And I think there's a lot of debate out there on it now, but it's a good bit away, Pat, but there is a lot of work going on.
I think a really good question for Ben. Ben, can you explain or suggest why there's such a drastic methane reduction effect of seaweed in the indoor experiments and no significant impact outside?
Could be due to a number of reasons. So the indoor experiments are using I suppose the most predominant one in the media is red seaweed, Asparagopsis. So within our study, we used a very, very small proportion of that within the supplement. So the majority of the seaweeds were just green and brown seaweeds, which I think have previously shown to be not as effective at mitigating methane. And the effect of recent research has shown that red seaweed, Asparagopsis, its effect actually diminishes the longer it's in storage. So our supplement was would have been waiting a number of months before it was actually fed out to the cows, so it could have potentially lost its efficacy in that storage period. And then you have to add into the fact as well that it was grazing, whereas that was indoors. When in that indoor study, they were continuously offered the supplement throughout the course of the day, whereas we were feeding them twice daily. So there's a number of different factors that could be applied there.
So what you're saying is there could be effect that it only has an effect for a very short time after the actual feeding, and if it's not included in the total.
Yeah, and its effect its actual potency could actually diminish over time as well. The longer it's in storage, which makes it difficult, because if we do find one that, if we do feed red seaweed, and we can't farm it in Ireland, the actual logistics of moving from one side of the world to the other, it's going to be very, very difficult. So there's all that to think of as well.
I think from the presentation that Sinead Waters gave us a few weeks ago, I think her thinking on that is that there would be synthetic versions of the seaweed, or that there would be extracts that were those methane reducing extracts that could be created synthetically. So I think maybe that would address some of the questions there around the carbon footprint of harvesting and transporting seaweed, which was being asked for. Ben, there was another question just while we were on you talking to you there. There was it in relation to the effect of the long-term feeding additives? So did we go through that with you at grass, the actual effect of feeding additives long-term at grass?
As in,
I think actually went through that one. I beg your pardon. Yeah. There's a question there about the methane reducing additives currently. Are they EU feed approved additives?
So I might take that one. There's very little, to be honest, Mark, in terms of available on the market today that are what I would call, more importantly, our own national inventory approved. So we have none that that we can feed, that we can get credit for in our national inventory. So there's a double approach here. There's almost a triple approach. We need an additive that works. We need to be able to get it into the inventory, and then obviously it needs to be approved at an EU level as a feed additive. And there's a whole set of prongs to that that have to go through different stages to get use.
Any plans to look at a methane vaccine similar to the research that's taking place in New Zealand?
Not at the moment.
Okay.
Pat, anything else coming through for?
Yeah, I suppose there's a number of questions about the metrics, whether we should be looking at per hectare, per litre, or all of the above in our considerations?
So and we do, to be honest. But I suppose if we look at, the two that count, when we sell product in the market, it's the footprint on the per kilo milk solids or per kilo of fat and protein corrected milk is what's of interest. And if we look at it from a national point of view, it's the total emissions that are important. And I suppose it's important to distinguish that there's a difference in methodology there. The national emissions don't account the embedded emissions that come in from other countries. So, for example, we bring in all our fertilizer. We don't include, in the national inventory, we don't include the emissions associated with that. Whereas in our own LCA that we would have presented, and with an LCA approach, you include those emissions. So, yeah, all of them are relevant. I suppose the footprint figure deals with the product. I think what the question might be getting at, by focusing on it per hectare, you're looking at the absolute emissions as a proxy. And that's something that we're looking at both, and that's why I think it was important. That's why I distinguished between the footprint and the total emissions as being two different things.
Okay, there's a kind of a comment here in relation to the inclusion of the social justification in EBI, also as value starts to be put on carbon emissions, that it will be an economic justification as well. I think that's probably a comment rather than a question. Just in terms of research in relation to the long-term impact of additives, and what is the research there? Is it something that is tending to tail off and cows get used to it, or is there research indicating that some of these additives have a sustained impact?
Tree Nop, I suppose it's the most successful one internationally. So it's commercially called Bovair. So that's been widely researched, and it's been consistently shown across a lot of studies to reduce methane over long-term periods. So that's definitely the most promising one. But the thing about Tree Nop is that it needs to be in the rumen continuously. So it's very, very much suited to a TMR diet. There is research going on in New Zealand looking at developing slow release formulations. So, it does need to be tailored for pasture-based diets, but if it could be tailored, it'd be massive. But, we need to find out what the results will be from that research.
It's important to say also that the asparagus studies, the red seaweed studies, the Australian studies have shown over longer periods, like 130, 140, 150-day periods, that the effect is still there. So there are additives that are working over long periods, but it's a good question because initial work on additives had shown a decline on the efficacy over time. The rumen are changed to take account, but some of the newer products are working.
We have a question here in relation to the cost of these additives, and a commentary, I suppose, more than a question. But instead of putting a cost on farmers by adding feed additives to the diet, would it not be easier to adjust the sward and in the context of multi-species swards and reducing methane? I think quoting some research from Reading University here as well. Like over the last number of weeks, we've heard a lot from our colleagues, John Finn and colleagues in UCD, about the role of multi-species grassland. And I suppose in general, this more, we'll call them nature-based type solutions to addressing these problems. Maybe there is a concern that we're tending towards a route of engineering rather than looking at the more nature-based solutions. How would you respond to that, Laurence?
When you're in a corner and you're looking for solutions, you'll take any solution that comes, Mark. So absolutely, our plans are also to look at mixed species and its impact. There is some interesting work from the New Zealanders, and we were actually only talking to them yesterday on it in terms of the impact that potentially is there from a methane perspective. So absolutely, we will take all the solutions that can be got, and we will look at all the solutions.
Just a quick comment from somebody there. They're accusing us of not following through on the vaccine question. You're saying that there's no current plans. Maybe could you elaborate on that, Laurence, just for completeness?
Yeah, so we have to be clear, crystal clear on it. We've done nothing on it from a vaccine point of view. There's huge work gone on in New Zealand over the last 20 years. Now, this is just to be crystal clear. It's the methane vaccine. But yeah, we've done nothing on it from an Irish, except for looking at the literature and look at what's coming out. And it's something that we're watching the New Zealanders on, and we talk to them regularly. And it's nothing that's on our radar at the moment. Does that answer it?
Yes, I know. Thank you for that. It's just
there's a question there in relation to breeding, and you mentioned impact of breeds and whether or not individual breeds are showing a better footprint, and potentially in relation to crossbred animals as well. So just to maybe put a little bit of detail around that for people.
There's not very much research conducted on it. We are doing research this year, profiling the greenhouse gas methane emissions of the next generation herd in terms of their enteric fermentation, actual methane emissions measured. So we have high and low EBI cows, and we have the Jersey herd as well. So we've only begun the measurements, but it'll be a few months before we get enough data to look into it in more detail.
You're looking for another invite back in a few months.
I suppose that when we modeled it in the past, we've looked at it from a number of different studies. The crossbreds come out very well from a footprint point of view. So previous research has shown them in a very positive light.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. We're over time. I don't know where that hour went. Ben, Laurence, and Katie, thank you so much for your presentation. A reminder to everybody that the presentation and recording of today will be available on our website, and also we'll have a recording available on the new Signpost Series podcast, which is available on all of the various podcast platforms. Before we leave you today, I just want to bring to your attention a series of dialogues that the Department of Agriculture is organising over the next number of weeks, starting next Wednesday, the 21st of April. And it fits in with the overall United Nations Food Systems Summit, which is taking place throughout this year. So there's some really high profile speakers speaking during the series, dealing with sustainable food systems and foreign policy around a sustainable food system. So there's a huge array of talks available there. So I understand places are limited. So if you're interested in attending, you can go onto the Department of Agriculture website and register your place there. So really worth looking at that if you want to find out more about what's happening at I suppose, a global level around food systems security and sustainability. Pat, thanks very much for helping with questions today. And thanks to our production team, Andy Boland and Yvonne Marr, who are the stalwarts in this series. And thank you for tuning in today. Next week, we will be joined by, I had it on the tip of my tongue earlier on there now, Pat, you surely know who we have next week on our series. It's gone.
As well.
You can find out anyway. We'll play it at the end here. You can see who's coming up next week. But look, thanks very much for tuning in, and we will see you again next Friday morning at 9:30. Thanks again, Laurence, Katie, and Ben, and we'll talk to you again soon.